All right, let's jump right into this situation with Spain and China. They seem to be going their own way and causing a bit of a stir in the EU. We're going to explore why Spain's taking this gamble, what it means for Europe, and how it all fits into this bigger picture of global power, you know? Our main source for this deep dive is this article called China Steps In to Save Spain's Economy. Subtitle is pretty dramatic, too. A shocking shift causing turmoil in Europe.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating case study, how economic interests can sometimes clash with political alliances and all that.
Right, exactly. So to set the scene, Europe's car industry is facing some serious competition from China right now. Companies like BYD and NIO, they're producing electric vehicles that are not only high quality, but they're also super affordable.
Yeah, and that's a big problem for European car makers. They're kind of used to dominating the market. The EU's initial response was to consider tariffs. Like we're talking up to 38% on Chinese EVs to protect their own industry.
Okay, so that's where Spain kind of throws a wrench in the plan. They've openly opposed these tariffs, and it's left a lot of people confused. The article points out that Spain's economy has become really intertwined with China's.
Oh yeah, imagine this. 7 out of every 100 products that leave Spain are going straight to China. That's a huge chunk of their economy, especially for key sectors like machinery and agriculture. So you can see why a trade war would be a big concern for them. Could disrupt those supply chains, lead to job losses, even impact what's available for Spanish consumers.
Yeah, for sure. The article mentions that trade between Spain and China had surged 15% just last year. That's massive. Makes you wonder if they're becoming a little too reliant on China. What happens if things go south?
It's a calculated risk for sure. Spain's leaders clearly believe that deeper economic ties with China are worth the potential downsides. Remember that meeting between Prime Minister Sanchez and President Xi Jinping earlier this year? It wasn't just a photo op.
Right. It seems like they were laying the groundwork for even closer cooperation. And the numbers back that up. Spanish exports to China jumped another 12% after that meeting.
Yeah, it's almost like Spain is signaling, hey, we're open for business and we're not interested in those tariffs the EU is considering. But this move puts Spain's automotive and agricultural sectors in a really vulnerable position.
Yeah, the article highlights that a whopping 40% of Spain's pork exports go to China. We're talking a market worth over 1.5 billion euros every year.
A lot of ham at stake. Professor Hannon Moreno, an agricultural economist who's quoted in the article, warns about the potentially dire consequences for Spain's rural economy if China retaliates. And we know they're not shy about using economic leverage when they feel pressured.
Retaliation, that's the word that keeps popping up. So if the EU goes ahead with those tariffs, what could China target? What should European businesses be worried about?
We'll take luxury goods, for example. Brands like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, they depend heavily on Chinese consumers. Imagine walking into a high-end boutique in Paris or Milan, and like half the customers are from China. That's the reality. And if those shoppers suddenly stop buying, the impact would be felt through the whole industry.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. That's a huge chunk of their customer base.
Exactly. And the same goes for technology. Europe exports billions of euros worth of equipment to China every year. Any disruption to that would be a big blow.
Yeah, this situation is really exposing those fault lines within the EU, isn't it? It seems like each country has its own priorities, and they're not always aligned.
Exactly. You've got Germany with their massive car industry and big investments in China. They're hesitant about anything that could mess up that relationship.
Right. They're probably thinking like, let's not rock the boat too much. We got a good thing going here.
Exactly. But then you've got France and Italy. They're feeling the heat of that competition. They want more protectionist measures. Spain's stance just adds fuel to the fire.
And the article throws out this pretty crazy number. China had a 400 billion euro trade surplus with the EU in 2023. That's not just a number that's serious leverage.
Absolutely. As Europe buys more and more from China, they become more vulnerable to that economic pressure. Spain's walking a tightrope trying to benefit from that trade relationship without becoming too reliant on China.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. It seems like they're not just opposing tariffs. They're actively trying to position themselves as a bridge between Europe and China.
That's right, hoping to carve out a more independent leadership role. Within the EU, it's a bold move, but it could backfire.
If the EU implements those tariffs and China retaliates, Spain might be the first to feel the pain.
Exactly. It's a high-stakes game with potentially huge consequences. And that's just the economic side of things. The political dimensions are just as fascinating. And we'll dive into those in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've talked about all those economic factors driving Spain's decision, but it seems like there's a deeper political game at play here. What are Spain's long-term goals here? And how does this all fit into the dynamics within the EU?
Well, Spain's move has really put a spotlight on the internal divisions within the European Union. There are some pretty fundamental disagreements about how to approach China and the role that Europe should play in this evolving global order.
Right, it's like everyone's on the same team,
Hmm.
but they can't agree on a game plan. Some countries want to play it safe, others want to be more aggressive.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You've got Germany with its deep economic ties to China. They're hesitant to rock the boat too much. Then you have countries like France and Italy who are feeling the pressure from Chinese competition, and they're pushing for a more assertive stance, you
And
know?
then you have Spain trying to chart its own course, hoping to become this key go-between for the EU and China. But isn't that a pretty risky strategy?
It certainly is. Spain is betting that it can leverage its unique position to become an indispensable partner for both sides. They're hoping to gain influence, maybe even leadership within the EU, by acting as a bridge between these two economic powerhouses.
But what if this backfires? What if the EU goes ahead with the tariffs and China retaliates? Spain could end up taking the biggest hit.
That's the gamble they're taking. But it's important to remember that China's also playing a strategic game. Their ambitions go way beyond just selling electric vehicles or consumer goods. They're looking to reshape the whole global landscape and expand their sphere of influence.
The article even mentions China's Belt and Road Initiative. They're investing billions in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, even Europe.
Exactly. China is systematically building economic and political relationships across the globe. And Spain, by choosing to strengthen its ties with China, is essentially placing a bet on the rise of a new global superpower.
So it's not just about trade or tariffs, it's about aligning yourself with what might be the dominant force in the 21st century.
Precisely. And this puts the European Union in a tough spot. They need to find a way to present a united front with China, but that's proving to be a real challenge, given the different interests and perspectives within the bloc.
So what's the most likely outcome here? Will the EU find a way to overcome those internal divisions? Or will this just lead to more fragmentation?
It's impossible to say for sure, but one thing is clear: this is a defining moment for the European Union. Their response to the situation will have a ripple effect on the global stage. It could determine whether the EU emerges as a strong and cohesive force in the 21st century, or whether they become increasingly marginalized, as other powers like China assert themselves.
Wow, so there's a lot more at stake here than just electric vehicle prices. What are the broader implications of this for the global economy and for everyday people like us? We'll explore those questions in the final part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about Spain and their decision with China, and it's clear that this has implications way beyond just Spain and the EU. What does all this mean for the average person you know? How will these global power shifts actually impact our daily lives?
It's easy to think about geopolitics as something kind of distant, like something abstract. But these shifts have real impacts on us. Think about it: the prices of things we buy at the store, the stability of our jobs, even the availability of certain technologies. All of that can be affected by how countries relate to each other.
So you're saying that even if we're not directly involved in like international trade or diplomacy or whatever, we still feel the effects of all this.
Oh, absolutely. Take the price of gasoline, for example. If there's a conflict in the Middle East, that can disrupt oil production, and that leads to higher prices for everyone around the world. Or think about the supply chains for smartphones and computers. Many of those components are made in Asia. So if there's a trade war or political instability in that region, it can lead to delays and shortages for us.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really highlights how interconnected the world has become. We might not always see it, but what happens on the other side of the planet could have a direct impact on our own lives.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this whole thing with Spain and China. If the EU fragments and weakens because of this disagreement, it could create an opening for other countries like China to have more influence globally.
So in a way, Spain's decision is kind of like a bet on a future where China plays a much bigger role.
That's one way to look at it. And it's a risky bet with potentially big consequences for everyone. If China keeps rising economically and militarily, it will inevitably reshape the global landscape. The question is, what role will Europe play in this new order? Will they be a major player, or will they be sidelined?
Which brings us back to that key question. Will the EU be able to get over these internal divisions and present a united front? Or will this just weaken them and make them less influential on the world stage?
That's the big question, isn't it? The answer probably depends on a lot of things, like the leadership within the EU, the economic and political pressures on each member state, and the choices that China makes in the next few years.
It's a complicated situation that's always changing.
Mm,
Feels like we're witnessing a turning point in history. you know, like a shift in power that's going to have huge implications for all of us.
absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big takeaway for our listeners is stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. The world is changing fast. And understanding these global dynamics is key to navigating the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
Well said. It's a reminder that we're not just watching all this happen. Our choices, both individually and as a society, they're going to shape the future of our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Spain's China Gambit. Until next time, stay curious.